Before we dive deeper, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and comment below with your thoughts. Trust me, you're not ready for what's coming next. The prison gangs that ruled America? You won't believe what went on behind bars. Now, let's get into it. It was 2:47 a.m. when Officer Reynolds received the call. The night shift was usually uneventful, quiet, predictable. But that night, a violent eruption ripped through the heart of Rikers Island, the infamous New York City jail. The phone call was urgent, the officer's voice trembling. "Sergeant, we've got a situation. A riot. Gangs are fighting, it's spreading fast." By the time Reynolds arrived at the scene, chaos had already gripped the prison. Rikers Island, home to some of the most violent criminals in America, had just become ground zero for an all-out war. The prison's notorious gang factions, the Bloods, the Crips, and the Latin Kings had been at each other's throats for years. But this was something different. This wasn't just a few scraps between rival members. This was war. The hallways, usually patrolled by guards, were now flooded with inmates wielding makeshift weapons. Officers had already been overwhelmed, and the prison's security system was failing. Reynolds could hear the distant sounds of clanging metal and the shouts of inmates, but what caught his attention was the sheer intensity of it all. This wasn't just random violence, it was coordinated. "Watch your back," a fellow officer warned, his voice tight with fear. As Reynolds moved deeper into the prison, he saw bodies lying on the cold concrete floor, some motionless, others writhing in pain. Blood stained the tiles, pooling in every corner. The smell of sweat, fear, and blood hung heavy in the air. In the middle of the chaos, Reynolds spotted a familiar face, Jose El Diablo Martinez, the leader of the Latin Kings, standing tall and unscathed. His eyes burned with rage as he barked orders to his men. The Crips were taking heavy losses, but they were pushing forward, fueled by something far more dangerous than just anger. It didn't take long for Reynolds to realize this wasn't just a random outbreak. The bloodshed at Rikers was part of something much larger. The Latin Kings had been playing a dangerous game, and now the Crips, the Bloods, and other smaller gangs were being drawn into a deadly conflict that was going to span across multiple states. The violence at Rikers Island had been sparked by something as small as a shank fight, but it was now spreading like wildfire. Gangs on the East Coast had been sending messages back and forth through cryptic notes, secret phone calls, and hidden messages in the prison mail. These weren't just prison gangs anymore. They were organized, powerful, and ready to take control of any territory they could. As the hours ticked on, the prison guards struggled to regain control. Reynolds had seen his share of chaos in his career, but nothing like this. He had a sinking feeling that what happened at Rikers wasn't just a coincidence. There were whispers of the gang war spreading to prisons in California, Louisiana, and Texas. The bloodshed at Rikers was just the first move in a much larger game. Meanwhile, as the riot raged, a chilling discovery was made in the prison's south block. Hidden behind a false wall in a guard's locker room, investigators uncovered a stash of weapons, guns, knives, and ammunition. They were far beyond the typical prison contraband. This wasn't just a group of men fighting for survival. This was a well-planned, well-funded operation. But the real shock came when the gang's message was revealed, a coded note tucked inside a torn piece of cloth, found in the pocket of a dead Crip. The note was simple. "The war isn't just here. It's coming, nung to your backyard. The West Coast will burn next." The realization hit hard. What started on the East Coast was about to explode across America's prison system. Just as Reynolds was piecing together the implications of the message, a loud crash interrupted his thoughts. The door to the central control room was torn open, and through the smoke and haze, a man stepped in. It was the last person Reynolds expected to see, Dante "Kingpin" Hayes, leader of the Bloods, and one of the most feared criminals in the country. He had been locked up for over 10 years, but now, he was standing in front of Reynolds, free as a bird, his men behind him. Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. He knew this wasn't just a gang war, it was a battle for control of America's prisons, and it was only going to get worse. "Get ready," Kingpin said, his voice low and threatening. "This war's going national." The words echoed in Reynolds' mind as he realized what was at stake. The war that started on the East Coast was now on a collision course with the West. And it wasn't just about the gangs anymore. It was about who controlled the streets, the prisons, and ultimately, America's future. But when the investigators pulled out the last piece of evidence, a map with gang territories marked across the country, it became clear that this was only the beginning. You thought the chaos was contained on the East Coast? Think again. The fire is spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. Stay with us because what happens next will show you how far these prison gangs are willing to go. Hit subscribe, like, and share your thoughts. This story is just getting started. As the chaos from the Rikers Island riot made headlines across the country, law enforcement and prison officials on the West Coast braced themselves. The message was clear. The East Coast gang war was no isolated incident. What had begun as a battle between rival prison gangs was about to spill over into California's most notorious prisons. And it wouldn't be long before the violence reached the streets. The word had already spread like wildfire, from the tight-knit cells of Rikers Island to the sun-baked yards of San Quentin State Prison, one of the most dangerous correctional facilities in the U.S. The same battle for power, the same brutal tactics, were now being imported into California's prison system, threatening to turn it into a war zone. Inside San Quentin's high-security block, gangs like the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood prepared for war. But the real threat was the growing influence of the Bloods and the Crips, who had spent years making connections, gathering resources, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to expand their power. Detective Mike Harris, a seasoned investigator with the California Department of Corrections, had seen his share of prison violence. But nothing could have prepared him for the storm that was about to hit. His team had received intel about an influx of weapons and outside money into the prisons, but it wasn't until he got the call from an informant inside San Quentin that things started to make sense. "They're making moves," the informant whispered through the phone, his voice shaky with fear. "The Bloods and Crips have joined forces. They're planning something big, something that'll shake the whole system." Mike's heart sank. A Blood-Crip alliance was unprecedented. These two factions had fought for decades, each one trying to dominate the prison system. But if they were working together, it meant something far more dangerous was on the horizon. As Mike pieced together the information, he realized just how deep the conspiracy ran. The gangs were no longer just fighting for control of the prison yards. They had expanded their reach into the guards, into the outside world, and into the very fabric of the criminal underworld. At the same time, something sinister was unfolding at Pelican Bay State Prison, a maximum security facility in Northern California. Pelican Bay, with its sprawling complex of concrete cells and high walls, had long been a place for the most dangerous criminals in the state. But recently, something had shifted. A new power had begun to rise within its walls. Mason Kincaid, a notorious Crip gang leader with a bloody reputation, had been transferred to Pelican Bay after a failed escape attempt in Los Angeles. But now, he was more dangerous than ever. Reports from the prison indicated that he had begun to organize the inmates in a way that was unlike anything seen before. He wasn't just running the Crips, he was building an empire, one that extended beyond Pelican Bay. Kincaid's influence had already spread to the guards, some of whom had become involved in smuggling contraband into the prison. But Kincaid had his sights set on something bigger, the prison system itself. He wasn't content with just running the yard at Pelican Bay. He wanted to take control of the entire West Coast. One of Kincaid's most trusted lieutenants, Tyrone Big T. Jackson, had been quietly working behind the scenes, coordinating with gangs from all over the state. With a vast network of contacts in the criminal world, Big T had begun to funnel money and resources into Pelican Bay. The plan was simple: control the prisons, control the streets, But the prison system had its own way of dealing with rising threats. Warden Richard Hayes, a no-nonsense veteran of the corrections system, had been keeping an eye on Kincaid from the moment he arrived. Hayes knew how dangerous Kincaid was, but he underestimated the scale of the operation that was being built in Pelican Bay. Back in Los Angeles, the tension continued to mount. Gang-related violence had already begun to surge in neighborhoods across the city. The Bloods, Crips, and other smaller factions were preparing for the full-scale gang war that was coming. What had started in the prisons was now spilling out into the streets. Law enforcement struggled to keep up as gang members battled for control of turf, and innocent bystanders became caught in the crossfire. As the violence escalated, the authorities realized they were dealing with something far beyond just prison gangs. The criminal underworld was being reshaped, and no one knew how far the ripples of this war would spread. But the most chilling part of it all was the realization that the gangs weren't just fighting for power, they were fighting for survival. With the alliance between the Bloods and Crips growing stronger, every move they made had the potential to destabilize the entire prison system and the streets of America. As the weeks passed, the gang war on the West Coast reached a boiling point. Rumors of a coordinated attack on California's prison system spread like wildfire. And then, it happened. The prison riot that started in San Quentin quickly spread to Folsom and Pelican Bay. It wasn't just a fight for control anymore, it was a war. A war that had crossed state lines and spilled out into the streets of Los Angeles, Oakland, and beyond. The gangs had set their sights on the ultimate prize, domination of the entire West Coast prison system. But when the first prison riot broke out in San Quentin, a new message was discovered, one that would change everything. The battle for control is reaching its climax, but the truth is more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and comment below because you won't believe how this story ends. Stay with us, because the prison gang war is about to spill out of control. The prison system had become a battleground, a war zone where the most dangerous men in America fought not only for power inside the walls, but for control of the streets outside. From California to New York, the gang war that began with small, isolated conflicts in prison yards had now exploded into a nationwide crisis. The violent alliances between the Bloods, Crips, and other gangs were no longer contained in the shadows. They were spreading like wildfire. The breaking point came when the riots spread to the streets of Los Angeles. Armed gangs, under the direction of their imprisoned leaders, started to target high-profile businesses, police stations, and residential areas. For the first time in history, the line between the prison system and the streets had blurred completely. The power held by the gangs was undeniable. In Pelican Bay, Mason Kincaid's empire was rapidly growing. His name was feared not just within the prison, but in the criminal underworld outside. He had orchestrated a network that connected his gang with powerful figures in the street and the prison systems across the state. The quiet alliance between the Bloods and Crips, originally seen as an impossible partnership, was now a force to be reckoned with. Detective Mike Harris had been tracking the gangs for months, but he could never have predicted how quickly everything would escalate. The information he'd gathered pointed to a larger, far-reaching conspiracy, a criminal network that was now firmly entrenched in both the prison system and the streets. Gangs like the Bloods and Crips had grown beyond the prison yard. They had evolved into an underground empire. Harris was now in a race against time to stop the explosion from engulfing all of California. Working with local police, he began to piece together the final elements of the plan, a coordinated attack on the prison system that would unleash total chaos. The riots were just the beginning. What Kincaid and his lieutenants had planned was far more dangerous. A takeover. Back at San Quentin, Warden Hayes was growing more desperate. The riots had torn the prison apart, but he had no idea who was behind the attacks. Inmates were being used as pawns, manipulated by gang leaders like Kincaid to push their agendas forward. What Hayes didn't realize was that the system he had spent decades controlling was now slipping from his grasp. The gangs had infiltrated every level, from the guards to the inmates to the officials in charge of the entire prison system. One afternoon, Hayes received a call from an anonymous source, a voice on the other end telling him that the game was rigged. The person was clear. Kincaid had planned everything, and the gangs were now working together to bring down the entire prison system. Hayes didn't believe it at first, but then came the startling discovery: a hidden ledger that connected Kincaid to several high-ranking officials in the prison system, including some members of law enforcement. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah Matthews, who had been investigating gang violence in California prisons, had managed to infiltrate one of Kincaid's key operations. She had uncovered one of his secret meetings, hidden deep in the yard at Pelican Bay. Disguised as an inmate, Sarah had witnessed a private exchange between Kincaid and his lieutenants. They were planning something big, bigger than anything she had imagined, a full-scale assault on the prison infrastructure. The gangs were preparing to take control of the guards' towers, the communication systems, and even the administration. Once the prison system fell into their hands, they would be unstoppable. But Sarah had also found something unexpected: an alliance within the prison. It wasn't just Kincaid and the Crips anymore. The Aryan Brotherhood, who had long been enemies of the Crips, had secretly formed an alliance to ensure control of the drug trade inside the prison. The two factions, once sworn enemies, had now united against a common enemy: the system itself. The realization hit Sarah like a cold wave. The war wasn't just about power. It was about control of an empire that reached beyond the prison walls. The gangs weren't simply fighting for dominance. They were fighting to control an entire criminal enterprise that had been decades in the making. The final confrontation was inevitable. In a last-ditch attempt to regain control, Detective Mike Harris, along with a tactical team, stormed the central control room at Pelican Bay. They had discovered the final piece of the puzzle. Kincaid was about to launch the final phase of his plan, a full-scale takeover of the state's prison system, with the goal of expanding his empire into the streets. But as the team moved in to make the arrest, they were met with resistance not from inmates, but from the very officers who were supposed to protect the prison. Kincaid's network had infiltrated the highest levels of the prison, and there was no one left to trust. The scene unfolded like something out of a nightmare. As the officers exchanged gunfire, Sarah found herself cornered in the chaos, surrounded by both gang members and corrupt officers. The prison walls, once a symbol of control, now felt like a tomb, closing in on everyone inside. In the final moments of the standoff, Kincaid made a bold move. He escaped, vanishing into the shadows, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a prison system on the brink of collapse. As the dust settled, Detective Harris was left standing in the wreckage, his mind racing with one horrifying question: who was really in control now? The gangs had won this battle, but the war was far from over. They thought Kincaid was behind bars for good, but what happened next will make you question everything. Stay tuned, because the truth is far darker than you can imagine.